All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to start. Thanks everyone for coming to this final talk at CFC, and thanks to everyone who participated in organizing it and coming and learning amongst all of us. Today I'm going to talk about something that is very dear to my heart and involves, as with many of you, integration of origami and something else they're interested in. For me, that is botany. Some of you may know that I've done a bunch of different polyhedra, as well as some representational models. But the more I got into designing, and as I went to college, I became more interested in plants. And I learned that I was actually pretty good at taking care of them. I ran a greenhouse for 3 years during my undergraduate years, and that involved native plants to Maine. Maine is a state that is in New England in northeastern North America, where it's pretty cold. But during the summer, you can see these carnivorous plants pop up, and they eat flies and other things like that. Being a scientist and a natural historian, I was really interested also in the beautiful lithographs and woodcuts and prints of these same plants, like from Ernst Haeckel. And so I wanted to emulate those in origami as well. So on my journey, I also realized that plants are pretty popular in origami, and many people have folded many different kinds of species, including orchids. Naomiki Sato is famous for his roses, and things like that. But we were giving so much attention to try and think about the ways that we transform paper into plants that we were lacking the background knowledge of thinking about how plants are turned into paper. So, thinking backwards, we start with our finished origami product. We do need paper to fold those things. And paper is an organic material and comes from plants. So this is the process. To facilitate this process, people are needed at each step. So we have the origamists who transform the the paper into origami. And we have paper makers that transform plants into paper. So that means origami is a form of ethnobotany. Ethnobotany being the field that I study. And it is defined as the scientific study of the relationships between people and plants. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and characterize origami as a whole. So a long time ago, maybe a little bit more recent than we think, origami looked like this. We had many different kinds of relatively simple models, the crane, the treble wit, frogs, and things like that. What facilitated this? Many of you know the story, probably all of you know the story of Akira Yoshizawa, of course, from Japan. He was invited to exhibit in Europe something like 70 years ago, and then all of a sudden, origami is on the world stage and has spread around the world. So, in that span of time, less than a century, you see origami transforming from this into that. In addition, we see that the internal structure of origami has transformed from that into this. But to do that, we can't just use any old paper. And one of the recurring themes at CFC this year has been, what kinds of paper do you use and why do you use it, right? One way to facilitate this is to make your own paper, right? And so we see this from Michael LaFosse, Richard Alexander, Paper Circle in Ohio, and Fabian Correa in Colombia. Another way to do it is to co-opt paper. So long ago, these were the papers that were available in Japan. And once that happened, we now have a whole ton of papers that have had uses that were not intended for origami, but that the origami community has co-opted and now uses to fold. But we also need to give credit where it's due. So one great example of this co-optation is with zaw paper in northern Vietnam. And in Vietnam, it's often hard to find the paper that you need to fold with. And Zaw paper is indigenous to the country, and Kuang has used this paper and treated it appropriately to be suitable for the highly complex models that he folds. Initially, Zaw paper was used for these dongho paintings, which have been made for something like 800 years. And they're given as like good luck charms to bode well for weddings, for the new Chinese New Year, and things like that. So, to try and convince you that this is an important thing to consider in origami, y'all have taken a survey. And so here most of you would consider yourselves experts, right? And one of the questions was considering, well, what are the qualities that you look for in paper when you fold with it? And so we have these various different qualities of varying degrees, but I want to point out to you that there are 3 qualities that you really look for. It's the thickness or thinness of the paper, the resistance of that paper to tearing, and the crispness of that paper overwhelmingly are important in folding. And as you can see, paper choice is quite important, right? You can't fold with any paper, and that translates to the quality of your finished model. So to draw from the material science and industrial papermaking literature, we can see that on the right, there are these various metrics, including burst strength, tensile strength, double fold strength, and paper density. And we can see that the fiber length, that is the fibers that compose the paper, are really important to the burst strength, tensile strength, and double fold strength. I'll talk a little bit more about these later on. But these are really just metrics of the paper strength and the paper quality. Another thing to note is not only many different kinds of plants can be used to make paper, but also different parts of plants. What we're most familiar with is the wood. And so the wood is the hardest part of the plant. It has a lot of lignin, but the lignin is brittle. Lignin makes it really hard to make folds, and if there's a high lignin content, the paper is going to be brittle. So you have to take that out, and there are industrial processes to eliminate them. If you were to take a stem or a trunk of a tree and did a section and stain them, you would see this. So all this is wood, lignified cellulose. On the outside, you have the layer of phloem. The phloem is the tissue that brings sugars down from the leaves to the rest of the plant. And that's what you see that is dyed blue and not purple. And on the outside, to protect all those layers, is the bark. If you were to do a longitudinal section, you can still see the same thing. And of course, you can see all these long fibers that compose both the wood as well as the phloem. In the papermaking literature, when phloem is used as a fiber source, we call it bast. Okay, so here we can look at fiber lengths in various types of fibers. So on the left, you see hardwood fibers. These are things that don't bear cones, but have secondary growth, woody growth. And these are various different hardwoods. And the fiber lengths aren't quite that long. There's maybe 1 to 2 millimeters. If you were to look at softwoods, these are your cone-bearing plants, things like spruces and pines. You have longer fibers, right? From 2 to about 7 millimeters. So that bodes well. The thing is, when you do your paper making, oftentimes you throw your fibers in a Hollander beater, and this is what is done industrially. And you have this ring of slurry. You have your fibers going in water in a circle, and they go under these blades, right? But notice that the blades are oriented perpendicularly to the direction of flow. So what these blades do, you can raise this beater up and down to adjust the ultimate fiber length when you finish running your slurry of paper around. So if you lower this rotating machine, it'll cut the fibers into shorter pieces. If you have it a little bit higher, you'll have longer pieces. So what this means is that oftentimes what you see here is actually shorter at the end. Okay, so grasses. Grasses are not woody plants. They don't have true woody growth, even though things like bamboo look hard. And the fiber length also is fairly short, from 0.2 to 3.1 millimeters. Not what we're looking for. What about bast? Okay, so again, the bast fibers are in blue here. You don't see very much of it, right? Most of the tissue in a stem is woody. But what people have done for a long time, bast is rich in cellulose and low in lignin. And so this is probably a pretty good source of fiber that you can use. So one common source is from this group of plants, which we'll talk about a little bit more, called the Thymelaceae. So this looks pretty good, right? We have 0.5 to 7.5 millimeters, and some of these, like this Daphne bolua, 2 to 7.5 millimeters, right? Long fibers, that's good. And then there are others, some of which look familiar. So paper mulberry, your kozo, that's about 10 millimeters long. Abaca, which is used in origami paper, 6 millimeters long. That's also good, right? But what we see is there's a difference in how you process the paper. In the West, you have the blades that are oriented perpendicular to the flow of water. And here you can see these blades, which are running parallel to the flow of water, right? And so what these blades, they're not even sharpened, do is simply to orient the fibers in a particular direction rather than necessarily chopping them. Fun fact, the naginata, I believe, refers to the curved blade that samurai would use when they commit seppuku. But here they're being used for a happier purpose. Okay. So I ran a simple t-test in R with regards to data from this question. How important is learning about machine-made paper versus handmade paper? And we see that there is a significant difference. More of you are interested in handmade paper than the process of making paper by machine. Great. So y'all are supportive. That's great. Taken together, these are all plants that can be used in hand paper making. There's a remarkable diversity. You have papyrus, you have a component of lokta paper, paper mulberry, flax, zaw, etc. So if plants, really, most plants are filled with cellulose. They have a lot of cellulose, right? We only see certain plants that are used in a particular environment by certain cultures. And why do people use certain plants and not others? So we can see, I propose that there are 5 criteria that stipulate whether or not you use a plant for paper making or not. Long fibers. I went to great lengths to convince you that this is really critical. The plant needs to be abundant, right? So if you're going to go through all the effort of making paper by hand, the plant has to be pretty common. Third, the plant has to regenerate. So if you do your harvest and you're left with nothing, you can't make paper later on, and that's not a good income source. You can't spend too much time processing it. So many of the people who do make paper by hand have other things to do. They might work on a farm, and they might need to harvest rice, things like that. So minimizing the time of process is critical. Finally, toxicity. So paper is a biodegradable material. And there are lots of herbivorous insects that want to eat these fibers. And so toxicity is a great way to deter those insects from eating your paper. And so once you run it through this gauntlet of criteria, you have your set of paper plants. So here are some examples. You see abaca, flax, and sun hemp. In some cases, you have these specific species that are well suited to paper making. And if you like to read more about some of them, you can read Ilan Ngadi's article on origami paper, which uses abaca fibers here. But what's interesting is in evolutionary biology, you learn that plants with really any species with similar characteristics tend to have a shared evolutionary history. And so what you see is clustering of plants in particular families. So families are like species, just a higher, more inclusive group. So one group is the Moraceae. The Moraceae includes your mulberries, your Osage orange, your figs, things like that. And these include your kozo and hanji. They include a species called snai or koi, which is called in Thailand. They use for paper making in that part of Southeast Asia, as well as amate. Now, some people might not consider amate true paper because the fibers are not dispersed in water, but they still are pounded into a laminar sheet. And you'll notice one quality of the Moraceae is that you have these milky latex. If you were to take your fig that you have in your windowsill and cut off a branch, you'll see this latex coming out. And this latex serves a purpose to deter insects from eating the plant. And I won't be talking about it, but if you want to learn more about how kozo is made, Elon has a great article as well. So for me, a more remarkable example is something that I picked up in botany textbooks. And there's a famous botanist who worked in Ecuador named Alwyn Gentry. He unfortunately passed away about 25 years ago. But he notes that there's a particular group of plants that have a particular unmistakable character. And that is the thick, homogeneous bark of this group is extremely strong, and any part of it strips as a unit. You can see they're stripping the bark here as a unit from the point of incision all the way to the base. And that group is a Thymelaceae. So this is a group of plants that has about 900 species. You can find it in tropical and warm temperate parts of the world. They include Gampi, Mitsumata, and Locta. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about 4 vignettes: Ergali in Nepal, Zoliet in Vietnam, Zaw in northern Vietnam, and Hao Pao in northeastern Vietnam. And if time permits, I'm going to talk about 2 more. So first, I'm going to start with Ergali. So in Nepal, you actually have 3 species that are used to make paper. You have Daphne boloa, which is called Locta, Daphne papyracea, which is called Kagate or Kagatpate. And you can see the origin of this name from Nepali, Kagaj, or Arabic, Kagad, meaning paper. And then Ergali, which is found in eastern Nepal. It's really confusing because different ethnic groups across Nepal will refer to these 3 species almost interchangeably. So just for convenience, I'm going to select these local names and apply them to these specific species. So here are the distributions of these 3 species across Nepal. You can see Boloa and Papyracea are found throughout this band. Northern Nepal is the Himalaya, right? It's too high and too cold to grow these plants. And then in southern Nepal, near the border with India, it's too hot. So they like this intermediate range at mid-elevation. Edgeworthia, this Ergali, is found in the eastern part of the country. So I went to Panchtar, Nepal in December of 2018 to really see what's going on with this. So Ergali, if you go to Panchtar, Nepal, actually grows pretty close to where people are using and transporting and making this paper. And so I've circled those in red. So here's a video that shows a guide of mine, the process of making this paper, excuse me. Okay, so we have a big branch. We got rid of the leaves. And he's selecting only the stoutest branches for making paper. They use a metal cup to get rid of the outer bark. And then they peel the bast off like this. And they let it dry in the sun. They send the dried bales to the place where the paper is made, and then they're re-soaked in water to soften them. Once they're rehydrated, you squeeze them, try and get a little bit of the water out, and then you put it on this stone and beat it. You also want to get some of the dirt and rocks and other particles that you don't want. And you put it on the stone. And here they're just using pieces of wood thrown in a brick, and you beat it. So you get this nice pancake of fiber, and you keep turning it to try and get a uniform separation of the layers and the fibers. And then you have to cook the fibers. They weren't cooking this day, so I didn't show you that, but I have other videos that depict this. And so when you mix the pulp in a suspension of water, you get this goop. And so this is their method of sheet formation. You just have this frame with something like mosquito netting. You put it a little bit in this basin of water, and then you pour the fiber. What she's doing here is she has this formation aid. It's this snot-like material. You have to mix it with the fiber, but it's kind of gelatinous, and it helps disperse the fibers evenly on the frame. In addition, it also helps inhibit the drainage of the water from the frame too fast. And so that gives you a little bit of time to even out the layers of fiber on the frame. So now she's taken the frame out with a very thin layer of wet paper on it. And she puts it off to the side, and then she will arrange it later in the sun so it dries. And there's that sheet coming right off. This is a book that was published 50 years ago. It hasn't changed much. I'm going to switch gears to Za. Many of you have folded with this. Za is harvested near this village called Sung, and then it is transported to Zheng'ao, which is a village that has made this paper for something like 800 years. At Sung, they have one ethnic group who harvests the fiber, and at Zheng'ao, you have a different ethnic group that makes the paper. And again, it goes from the incision all the way up, right? So once you peel the fiber, you have to soak it to soften it. You also want to remove the outer bark, as before. So here they're adding an alkaline solution. They can use soda ash, they can use sodium hydroxide, and you have to cook it, and this helps separate those fibers. This is the most onerous part. You have to beat all those fibers. This is what they use for formation aid. It's a species called Ma. And so he's shaving the wood, and the wood shavings are put in water. And again, you can see the water's a little bit thicker. It doesn't pour the way pure water would. And so they soak it for just like a day. And then you mix the fibers along with the formation aid from the Ma tree. And you can see a lot of similarities. If you watch her, she's been doing this since she was a tween. And she gets up at 4 in the morning to make these sheets, and then she finishes by 1 or 2. And this technique is very similar to the Nagashizuki technique they use in Japan. So here she has her sugeta, or her frame, and it's made of bamboo. You'll see it's not like the mosquito-style mat or mosquito netting style frame. This is really hard, and it takes years to master, but she makes it look extremely easy. That's right. And so yeah, there was a screw press. They're pressed away, and this is what's happening. So you can peel the sheet right off. And then the other side, you might have some fibers that wanted to stick to the rest of the stack, or what you would call a post. And so she's just brushing them back to be flat. Then, when you've done all that peeling, you have to stick them back together because they're wet. And Vietnam is a very humid country. It rains throughout the year. You have 2 seasons where it's rainy and a little bit less rainy. So in order to dry them, what you do is you stick them on the wall, and you use an army of floor fans to dry these stacks of sheets. And then you can use a paint scraper to get all the bits of paper that are stuck on the wall off. What is this paper used for? I mentioned the Dongho paintings, and here's a wood carver making a block for those prints. It's a very meticulous job. And then you have these blocks that are carved in such a way that you can stack the prints, one block for each color. And then you burnish the sheet on the block, and you get a finished Dongho painting. So, in Zhong'o, they also do the Dongho paintings. But back in Sung, where the fibers are harvested, this tradition of paper making used to exist, but it went extinct about 40 years ago. And so I spoke with this man who recounts the time that I used to make this paper for votive burning. They would make votive paper, and then on holidays or special occasions or to revere the ancestors, they would cut them up, and they would call this money. And they cut the sheets like this, and then use a wooden embosser to emboss like a curly pattern into the paper, and then they would burn it. But this tradition is no longer practiced in Sung village. So what Nguyen Hung Kung has demonstrated is that this paper is excellent for folding in origami. It's very thin, it's very strong, and other artists around the world now can use it to make their origami. So Joliet is the next case study. It's made in Vinh, which is Ho Chi Minh's birthplace in Nghệ An province. And again, the same procedure happens, just a different species because that's what grows in their area. So you skin the outer bark off the inner bark, and you cook it, and you have to pound the fibers. They use a different species for their formation aid. This is related to laurels. It's called bim bim. And you get this really thick goop that all comes from the wood shavings. And then you mix a little bit with the pulp and the water. And here's the mosquito netting again. It's stretched on a frame made from steel rods. And they have a little hook that they use to rotate the frame so that you get an even distribution of fiber on the frame. And again, you can see the water is draining much more slowly than if they were to use the suspension without the formation aid. So then once the layer is evenly distributed, you want to get the excess formation aid off. So she puts it back into the bucket. And then once everything has drained, she's going to take that and put it in the sun. So this paper is used to wrap fish. It keeps the fish fresh when it's sold on the coast. And then now here she is pulling that really thin sheet of paper off. So the sheet is extremely thin, and they do that so that they can see if the fish is good quality through the paper. Okay, one more, hao pao. So hao pao is made in northeastern Vietnam. The Cao Lan ethnic group do that, and here's Dung Van Quang, who's making the hao pao paper using the same stretched mosquito netting, but he does it suspended in water on the ground. They use it to record their family history. So I was like, this is an interesting species, and of course their local knowledge is a little bit different from the way a botanist would acknowledge it, and that is, you don't see the scientific name. But I wanted to try and figure it out, and I had a hunch, well, maybe it's Thymelaceae, like the guy is pulling the bark all the way down off the stem. It has the same qualities as his family. So could it be Thymelaceae? I asked this guy. He's at New Mexico State University, and he's a world expert on this family, and he looked at it and he's like, oh yeah, that's Lanostoma persimile, and we have records only in northern Thailand and Laos. So this is the first record from northern Vietnam, and that's new to the Western world, but of course they've been using this species for a long time. So very cool. So, well, how good is this paper for folding? You can ask Ryan Charpentier, and he made Shuki's camel, and I'd say it looks pretty good. So, there's a few more experiments. I really want to quickly cover this species, the leatherwood. If you look back at this map of the distribution of Thymelaceae, you'll notice that the Americas have it too. And you'll notice that leatherwood is one of those species in that family, and it's quite famous because Henry David Thoreau actually wrote about it in his journal. This genus actually is composed of 4 species. You have one that is widespread all across eastern North America, and then you have 3 localized endemics in the Bay Area, in the Ozarks, and in Tamaulipas in Mexico. So despite this broad distribution, you really never find it very commonly. It's kind of rare. So I think that is the reason why no one has used it for paper. Despite this, Zach Hudson wanted to see, well, it has the same qualities. It's related to Mitsumara and Gampi. Maybe we can use it for paper making. And one thing that botanists do is that they take selfies with plants. So
hello, my name is Zachary Hudson, and I'm a graduate student in horticulture.
Here's their
I'm a graduate student in fine arts.
video they made.
The medium for our project is made from the bark of Durca mexicana, which are the plants behind us. And here I have some bark that's already been peeled off. And the bark is extra strong because of the amount of fibers that are in it. So let us demonstrate.
So here's a close-up of the bark. After it's peeled, they're hung to dry. They're shaved. The exterior of the bark is shaved. And after they're cooked, the fibers separate. Then you have to pick away all the impurities. This is a very time-consuming task. And oftentimes you even need tweezers to do that. So after they're pounded,
Was made using the same technique as another common printmaking paper, washi.
this is Tim Barrett. He's a MacArthur genius because he went to Japan to learn Japanese paper making.
Graduate faculty printmakers from Iowa State University, as well as professional
They're adding the formation aid. There's a screw press.
to create an original image and print it on our paper.
On display is a juried selection of 12 prints on our Durca paper.
They're using the sugeta to make the sheets.
Of printmaking processes, including lithography, intaglio, relief, screen printing, and digital.
Rolling the bamboo mat off. And then after that, to expedite the drying process, you can actually paint the sheets on a heated metal plate, and it will dry, and then you can peel the paper off. So what Zach does is he wanted to see, well, is this paper good for printmaking? And yeah, it is. So they did an exhibit with their prints. But he also did some scientific tests. And what we see is that if you put samples in this machine called a double fold tester, this goes back to the table I showed you with different paper quality metrics, it stretches a piece of paper, a small sample, and all it does is the bottom part is like a metronome or pendulum and swings back and forth and folds the paper one way and then back the other way, on and on and on and on. And so what we see is that Gampi and Mitsumata have double fold values that are in the 200s. And Leatherwood has double fold values 6 times that. So proof of concept. Zach was very nice and sent me some sheets. And this you can see in the exhibition room. And don't take my word for it. You can ask Jared. And he says, I needed extremely thin and strong paper for this, as a ton of tension is put on multiple points. This rare leatherwood was perfect. I'm going to mention one more species. This is Mitnan. There's a paper that was published in 1983. There was a factory that was started in Be'er Sheva, Israel. You can see it's in the Thamiliaceae, and people used it for the purpose of rope. It's a very old word that dates back several millennia, and it connotes strong. You can see people twisting the fibers into rope and using the rope to support water and other canteens on camels. So the species looks like this. You can find it throughout the Mediterranean. If you were to go to Barcelona, you'd probably find it. And even though a lot of time has passed, there's still one person who made it. The factory is unfortunately since closed, and her name is Orna Chatzor. So she still makes this paper, and I have some with me, so if you want to check it out. And what she does is the same way. She strips away the bark, removes the external part, and uses the inner part of the bark or the phloem to make these sheets. So lots of plants have been used to make paper, and they still are. But why is this important? There are many threats to traditional hand paper making. They include the substitution of machine-made paper for handmade paper. That results in economic disincentivization. If there's no market for hand paper making, no one is going to continue to learn it. As a result, the older people fail to teach young people, and most of the people who still make paper today are fairly old. Just to drive this point home, in 1980, 5,000 people made Zaw paper in Zhong'an. In 2019, 3 families consisting of 15 people. Zoliet, 70 families made paper in Vin, and now only 5 do. Haupao paper, 3 people still make this. And I think origami can be a possible solution to preserve this really unique and global tradition. So machine-made papers are frequently an inferior substitute for many kinds of origami, especially the super complex ones. Consequently, many origami artists pay a premium for these handmade papers. So if there's a way that we can get local paper makers around the world to talk to origami artists also around the world and plug them into the global market, young paper makers might get the training they need and be able to make a living doing so. So one way to do that with a similar mission is Zaw Project. And I worked with Zaw in Hanoi to try and expand their collaborative to paper makers across Vietnam and help sell this paper around the world. So I hope I've shown you that these paper making traditions in Nepal, Vietnam, and elsewhere have given so much to the origami community. I argue it's now time that we need to give back to them. So I want to thank you for your time, thank the people that I've worked with for my thesis and to conduct these interviews, people who've given me money to do this, you all, and also you all. So thank you. So before I open it up to questions, I have this packet of sample handmade papers, and I'm going to pass it around, and you can actually get to experience some of them. Those sheets? Well, I have to use that for future talks, right? Okay, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, he's right.
open for questions.
Yes.
So you mentioned the length of fibers in paper as being one of the most important parameters, but what about width of the fibers? How do they impact paper?
Yeah, that's an important point. So one trait that's really interesting is the fiber is not actually solid. It's shaped like a straw. And so things like the width of the hole of the straw and the thickness of the straw itself are important factors. If the fiber has a small hole, it's more rigid. That makes sense. But it's also less flexible. And so what is also important is that, well, you need the fiber to be long, but also have a large aperture within the middle so it's more flexible. Adrian?
I am really chatty today. Okay, first of all, thank you so much for doing all this research. I'm like really excited that this is part of origami knowledge now. And I've talked to you about this like over the last few years. But what I'm curious about is what was most surprising or exciting for you in all of this research, whether it pertained to the paper making or the talking to origami people?
I think what was most stark to me, and the reason that I'm sharing this with you all, is that the degree of ambivalence of the paper makers that I interviewed, and it was very clear that they were so passionate about their craft. They spent so much time, they dedicated their lives to making paper, and now they're in this position where they know that this tradition and this knowledge will not be passed on, or is that it's at risk of being lost. And so you could see both their zeal for the craft and their dejectedness because the realities of the economy have put them to be the last of their kind. And so I'm really hoping and really exciting and asking all of you, maybe there's a way that we can help support them continue this tradition, not just for themselves, but for their own cultural legacy.
How sensitive is the process to the people? So if I have in Israel maybe those plants, and I have this guy who makes paper, handmade paper in Israel, if I give him the plants, will he be able to do the same paper, or is it they have like a special techniques, or this? Can I replicate it if I have the material? That's my question.
Absolutely. I've shown you clips that show that the technique is overwhelmingly similar across cultures, and this is what's really remarkable. You see that the tradition, despite spans of space that are over 3,000, 5,000 kilometers from place to place, all use more or less the same technique with a frame, the basin of water, the formation aid, etc. And so you can talk to many different paper makers. They might all have their own technique, but they're all variations on a theme. And so, yes, you definitely can find a way to use these plants and make the paper that you need.
So if we have the plants, the paper will never disappear because somebody can just go and make it. We can ask whoever makes paper, just please use this plant instead of this plant, and then we can have it.
Exactly, and that's definitely an important thing that I want to highlight. The conservation of not just the traditions is dependent on the conservation of the plants. So I think there's an advocacy that should be emphasized in that we need to ensure that the use is responsibly done, and that should be conducted by the people who use the paper because they know like what the good climate is, what the good time it is to harvest, how much they need to harvest, so that they can continue doing so.
And you covered this in your research?
Yes.
Good.
What's the best way for us to buy the paper in a way that supports the artists who are or the artisans who are making the paper?
Great. So that's something that is new territory for me, but I'm really excited to try and see what your needs are and find the common ground between that and also the paper makers. I did mention ZAW Project earlier, and they're that cooperative among different paper makers across northern Vietnam. I really enjoyed working with them. They were extremely helpful in translating with the different paper makers in different villages, and also they made this knowledge very accessible, and they were excited and encouraged to try and find ways to expand and support people who do this. So they asked me, I told them about this conference, they asked me, well, like, how much paper should we send to you or to Nicola, for example? Like, maybe there's a way that we can stock this in a responsible and accessible way. How much paper can we provision for this? And I think that's dependent on like how much interest there is amongst all of you, and also what needs that you have to use it. So please talk to me.
First of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting. Um, I read a book of a Frenchman whose name is Jean-Marc Ceci. And do you know the book? It's called Monsieur Origami.
I don't know the book, but I would love to read it.
And it's the story of a Japanese man who traveled to Italy, and he has, for all luggage, he has seeds of kozo plants. And when he arrived, he planted them and then wait them to grow and make paper. He keep for him the most beautiful pieces of paper and sell the other. And when he has done the paper, he fold origami, and then he unfold it to understand the origin of everything. And then something happened in the book, and I won't tell you, but it's very beautiful and very zen and very. And I think it's traduced in German. I don't know if it's in English, but...
Je peux le lire.
Ah, perfecto.
I would be interested in knowing if there's any tradition of making thicker sheets, things that could be wet folded, for example. Because what I've seen are very thin papers, very strong papers, which I like the second property a lot. The first, not always.
Absolutely. So this is definitely what's really cool. This is where you go to the technique of the paper maker. And so there are different methods. You can make the slurry where you have the water and you have the fiber in it. You can make it thicker. You add more fiber. And so that can help make a thicker sheet. The other way is that you can dunk your frame in a little bit more. And the length of time in which you suspend your, or you submerge your sugeta in the water also helps ensure that more fibers are added as a layer on your frame. So we can definitely make thicker sheets for your needs.
Wouldn't that also perhaps require to press the paper? Because if you don't, you run the risk of having very soft paper, which is very nice to play with, but doesn't hold the fold so much.
Sure, and the pressing is done. It wasn't depicted very well, but you saw clips of the screw press.
Ah, okay, I missed that bit. Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.